My name is Ashraf Al-Karmi. I'm the head of product management at a company called BrightCove. If you're not familiar with BrightCove, BrightCove is an online video platform. We publish the world's digital media in general. So we have two products, Video Cloud and App Cloud. Responsible for Video Cloud specifically. We offer an end-to-end solution where you just simply upload videos and we publish and help you monetize them, etc. And we're a cross-device platform. So we'll talk a little bit more throughout this conversation, and you'll get to see a lot of what we do as well. So I actually have two specific sections in this presentation. One is, let's set the stage on where HTML5 is and what it is. And then we'll talk about what are the things that are missing and what's next. So we'll start with setting the stage section. So if we talk about HTML5 video, who here, raise your hand if this is what you think of when you hear HTML5. This is what you see in your head when you think HTML5. Just one? So this is the most used logo for HTML5 video, and I don't actually think, even though I'm going to use it, this is not HTML5. This is HTML5. HTML5 is a huge stack of standards, and there's a lot of information behind the standards. And the table above, I know it's not clear, but I'll talk about what's in it in a future kind of section in this presentation. So HTML5 is not just a logo, it's not a marketing thing. It's essentially a lot of work, a lot of documentation, a lot of standards. We're going to go through some of the issues there and highlight what that means. So yes, I am a guilty person. I'm using the same logo here that everyone uses. HTML5 is a standard that mostly was started by a lot of different companies. It's being driven currently by W3C. When we talk about HTML5 video specifically, what's mostly relevant to us in this spec is the tags that you see on the right, the video, audio, and canvas tags, because these are the tags that you would essentially use to do a lot of interesting things with the video on devices that support HTML5. Of course, there's a whole lot of, I showed you the stat before. One engineer one time told me if I printed them, they'll stack up this high. So just so that you relate that. But we're specifically talking about these three tags. It's not a plugin based solution. It's just a tag that allows video to be played back. That's what the difference is between HTML4 and HTML5. It has been initiated by Apple, Mozilla, Google, and Opera, but it's adopted by so many companies right now. And we'll talk about that also in a little bit. So this is why we actually believe when we talk about HTML5, because there's a lot of big companies that are actually really motivated to get this moving, we believe that this is the future of the web. So that's one first thing that you should take away with this presentation. That's anything I highlight here is something you should remember. So today, 2/3 of the browsers on the internet actually have HTML5 support. So what are these browsers? So if we take a look, you'll see that IE9 Plus started HTML5 support. You'll have Firefox 3.6 Plus, Chrome 6 Plus, Safari 4 Plus, and Opera 10 Plus. So these are the browsers that currently support HTML5 video. Although what you'll see moving forward is that none of them support it in the same way. So that's one interesting thing. In terms of also how they support it, there's something called in the world WebKit, which is an open source project that was initially started by Apple that has a lot of work and has a lot of, in terms of specs implemented for HTML5 video. The Chrome and Safari specifically are built on top of WebKit, so you think, so they have the same base, it means they're very similar. No, they're not. Each company has their own branch, they're developing, even though it's open source, but you can take your own branch and develop on top of it, so essentially they are different because each company is taking a different aspect of it. So now that we're talking about browsers, so what about codecs? So when we talk about codecs, you should really be concerned about two at this point, H.264 and WebM. These are the high quality, high efficiency codecs. One is of course proprietary, and you've probably seen the announcement. about Google really endorsing WebM only. These are the two that you should be concerned about. But to summarize the support, you'll see that if you do grab H.264 and WebM, you're probably covered on all browsers that are important. So these are the two that you need to be aware of. But what does this mean? It means that we not only have some fragmentation and differences in video tag and audio tag and canvas implementations, but now we have to worry about codecs. So if and if you want to do one movie, and this movie is relevant here, I think, for some reason, since we're in California, you'll see that for you to actually deliver that video, you have to worry about actually all these codecs. So that's one point to keep remembering. And there's this information that I've highlighted here, that there's no single combination of containers and codecs that works in all HTML5 browsers. So that's one statement that, you should take away with you. And then you're going to have to encode your content more than once. In some cases, people try to include also the third spec by OGG, but again, you would probably get to all just by WebM and H.264. So that being said, let's talk about what's missing in the spec. So the spec has been there for a while, but it's missing a lot of things. So if we talk, we talked about video containers and codecs, there's nothing that the spec defines. There's the streaming protocols, adaptive, multi-bitrate, and the link list actually goes on. I don't even have here listed how you interact in full screen with SVG and CSS3, and there's so many different things that are applicable. But there's essentially, if you look at this, there's no definition on how video analytics in HTML5 work, so it's up to people to figure that out. In terms of advertising, that's still up in the air. There's still work on what is HTML5 advertising. So, and a lot of these things are not in any spec yet. Some of them are, but they're not really defined, and no one is really pushing forward aggressively on them. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So, based on that, I want you to take away that HTML5 is today where Flash was in 2002. So this means it has a lot of work to do before it's actually a complete solution. So people think HTML5, they're like, I have to be jumping on it. It's something that I have to do today. Yes and no. If we look at the internet traffic, and I got this from a Morgan Stanley paper, you'll see that you look at it and you're like, okay, so internet traffic on mobile devices is going to be equal, and then it'll exceed desktop traffic soon. And while this might be true, we have to remember that this is not the case today. You still have to be concerned about desktops today. We have to also remember that this is not, when we talk internet traffic, it's a little bit different than video traffic. Video consumption on smaller phones that probably consume a lot of internet traffic, there's not a whole lot of video consumptions on the 3-inch screen. We see it mostly on iPads, and we can talk a little bit more about that. While internet traffic might be a lot, the video traffic might not be as growing as that exact curve. And you should remember that desktops still drive a lot of traffic, and Flash has a deep penetration on desktops today. So that's one key takeaway for you. So basically, when we think HTML5, all of us link it to, actually, we do have an Android device here, but all of us think iOS. HTML5 is also Android, and I actually debated whether I should change the slide based on the Adobe announcement this morning. So if you haven't heard, Adobe is actually dropping the support of Flash players on mobile web browsers, which means they're not going to discontinue existing players or Flash versions, so you'll still have Flash Player 11 available, but moving forward, like there won't be Flash Player 12 on mobile devices, which means that essentially mobile devices might actually drop pre-installing or pre-packaging Flash, and that might change the world a little bit by, we'll start seeing more HTML5 traffic on Android devices than what it is today. And again, we'll talk about what we see from Brightco's perspective, what kind of traffic we're looking at. So when we talk about HTML5, we're talking about mobile devices. And based on the curve that we talked about before, yes, there is a cross, there's more internet traffic that's going to be driven by mobile devices in the future, but that's not the case today. And let's be realistic, the spec is not completely there yet. So when you think about HTML5, we encourage you to be pragmatic and not dogmatic. So you have to actually think, what is practical? What is, what matches theory versus practice and versus I'm all HTML5. If you actually implement that, it can work, but at the same time, you're losing a lot of different things. You're losing all the IE8 people in the world. So let's be realistic, that's a lot of people. So IE7, they still exist, believe it or not. Nothing against them, but they still exist. So that's the thing that I want you to take away, which is let's plan for HTML5. It's a future thing, we all agree, but let's not just be completely aggressive and don't apply practice into this theory. So let's talk about what's available there. And this slide, by the way, since iOS 5 launched, I haven't updated it, and I should because the numbers did change significantly. But what you'll see is that this is actual data from Brightcove on mobile devices hitting our system requesting HTML5 playback. So I want you to look at and see two things. First of all, you'll see that there's a whole lot of different versions hitting our system across all devices. So I want you to think in your head that this means each different version is trying to implement the spec slightly differently. So think of that and how it impacts fragmentation. So it is a very diverse world. And if you look at this, what you'll also see is that the adoption rate of newer versions is actually fast. Like up until 6-7 months ago, the 3.x iOS was about 50% of our traffic. And over 6 months, you see the numbers. We're talking about a total of 3.x in range of 6%. So people do upgrade their mobile devices frequently. So that's one other point that you can take away out of this. One thing not mentioned here, yes, we do have all these versions hitting our system. We see about 50% of our HTML5 traffic specifically going to iPads. So even though iPads have a much lower number out there than Androids and iPhones, we see iPads truly being the media consumption device. This is not just something that people say, we actually see it. People watch more content, longer form content on iPads than they do on iOS and Android in terms of mobile devices and 3-inch screens. The other thing that you should look at this and remember is HTML5 is not just iOS. A lot of people uninstall Flash from their Android devices. A lot of people don't have it installed and they refuse to install Flash on their devices. So what this means is that you do have Android users for HTML5. A lot of people don't remember that, but it is true. And the HTML5 implementation on Android is slightly different enough that you should think about it. So these are the things that I want you to think about. Android HTML5 traffic exists. People adopt to new versions quickly sometimes, specifically with iOS, and that iPad is the media consumption device. These are 3 good takeaways from this. Now, talking about that, it is a very fractured place. So if you own both devices, or like an iOS device, maybe an iPad or an Android phone, I do that myself specifically to kind of see different experiences, you'll see that there's some behavioral differences when you actually play back content from a browser. So the first difference is the full screen versus inline. On Android, just with 3.1 plus, they introduced inline playback. Before that, everything, you click on it, it goes full screen when you're in a browser. So that's a behavioral difference. The end of video or done button is different. There's the Android tablets full screen that I just talked about, and that's a behavioral difference. What we've seen was that there's browser event timing differences. And I'll try to explain this a little bit more. So if you click play, different things happen as the browser is getting ready to play and actually plays. So, and it actually tells you different events. So I'll tell you this story. I actually told it briefly yesterday in one of the panels I was in. I believe it was February or, beginning of February. When the engineering team, we had an issue where we had some issues in terms of playback on one of the devices. It was an older iPad. So the team went ahead and fixed it, and then internally when they were rerunning the test, they found out that the fix broke an iPad 4.3 implementation. So they went and fixed 4.3 and it broke 4.2. When they fixed 4.2, it broke Android 3.1 and it can continue. It actually lasted for a few days. So they came to me and said, this is not working. I said, okay, what do we do? They said, we have to solve the problem holistically. And we'll talk about how we think we solved the problem, but the reason why this happens is, and I'm going to try to explain on a technical level and a high level, so regardless of what your domain is, you'll hopefully understand this statement. If you're a technical person, you'll relate to this statement. The events that are being dispatched from the video tag are completely different and have a different sequence when you hit play versus pause versus full screen versus exit. So if you design any overlay or any plugin that works with that, and it's listening for specific events, it's different on all these different devices, so you have to account for it with if statements. So that's the technical jargon. On a higher level, each browser talks to us in a different language, so we have to understand it. And if you don't understand all languages and you're not able to translate, you're not able to understand. So you have to actually have this translation layer that understands all these differences and make it one. So there's also inconsistencies in the attributes that are in the tag, and I have listed some of them here. So the key message is, look at all these different versions, different implementations behaviorally, in the tag, and the attributes, and the timing, and you're talking about a mess from someone who's trying to implement across all these devices, a consistent, reliable experience. So, with that being said, this is one takeaway you should take with you, which is your homegrown HTML5 video solution is probably broken. And it's for all these reasons. Because if you didn't account for all these differences, it's broken. And we've seen it break. So that's one takeaway. All right, so I want to summarize this level set section that I said I'll cover in the beginning. So HTML5 is unquestionably the future of the web. That's a statement that I wanted you to take away. HTML5 video today is where Flash was in 2002. HTML5 video is most relevant today on mobile devices. Be pragmatic, not dogmatic when you think about HTML5 video implementation. Your homegrown HTML5 solution is probably broken. So now that we're level set, let's talk about what's next, which is, so what does HTML5 need to be truly compelling? What do we need to have for HTML5 to be truly compelling? I don't want to sound like a broken record, but it depends. This is not a good answer, I know, which means, yeah, what do we need to do in HTML5 for it to be compelling? Well, it depends on your use case, and we'll talk about why this is different. So if we want to make HTML5 truly compelling, there are several things that need to happen. So we talked about consistency. Consistency, on the right side I said which segment or which kind of implementation it's applicable to. Consistency is applicable to everyone. If your player breaks on Android tablets but works on iPads, that's big. I mean, you want it to work, you want that consistency. So regardless of your implementation, you want to make sure that your player works across all these devices. You want to build amazing experiences, and this is applicable to everyone trying to implement an HTML5 solution. We haven't talked much about it, but I'll mention that HTML5 has the chance to bring more compelling experiences than Flash. And the reason for that is because when you're actually interacting with a player, you're leveraging web technologies that are available. You're not recreating things in ActionScript. You can just plug into the player, you can do amazing experiences around it, leverage existing technologies. So you can actually create really interesting experiences around your player. So that's a good thing. But if it's not consistent, it doesn't mean anything. So that's why I actually ranked them in the order of what needs to happen first. So you would need consistency to bring the next level of bringing experiences. Advertising. we talked about that there's not a whole lot of standards there. There's an Internet Advertising Board, or IAB, that is trying to do some work there, and there's FAST implementations that are being proposed. If you're not familiar with FAST, it's the technology that was used to bring standards to advertising in Flash-based solutions. And we'll talk a little bit more about each of these sections, by the way. Analytics, this is applicable to some. So both advertising and analytics are not applicable to everyone, they're just applicable to some. And again, we'll drill deeper into each one. And content protection / DRM, they're different, but I've kind of bundled them. Content protection can be just simply encryption, and DRM is when you have policies and you know who the user is, and there's more authorizations and things involved, and individualization of the device you're on. And they're applicable to a few. So now, talking about what needs to happen for consistency. So consistency means that you're actually making everything look like it's the same. So if we look at Flash, what Flash did was they actually made the player run on all devices. Like you don't worry about whether the Flash player will run on a Mac versus a Windows. They took care of some of the things. When you develop on top of Flash, they expose a NetStream object where you can get consistent events across devices. So if we think in a model where with HTML5 that's not existent, someone has to come in and say, we're going to unify how that looks like. And in terms of consistency, we believe an abstraction layer to hide all these differences is needed, and that's what we've done at Brightcove. We've implemented an abstraction layer that actually hides all these differences, so you speak the Brightcove language per se, and you talk to all devices. It's not a proprietary language, it's just JavaScript events that we fire in a specific format, and as opposed to worrying about on a Safari versus Chrome, you just don't worry about it. So that's one thing that helps with consistency. And we'll talk about, if I want to go back to this slide before, by the way, I will talk, I want to mention a few things that I wanted to mention. Some of these are solvable by technology partners, some of these can be solved by standards, some of these can only be solved by device manufacturers, and we'll mention that. So consistency is one that a technology vendor like Brightcove is able to solve, and we have solved. So it depends on which area we're talking about, and we'll cover that hopefully as well. So we do have an HTML5 abstraction layer, and we'll talk later about the universal APIs, but that's a solution that can help solve the consistency problem across HTML5, and it's at the absolute base, because if you don't have consistency and reliability across devices, you're designing on top of a broken foundation. So, and the way we do that is you simply check a box and you leverage the whole thing. So I'm just trying to highlight that it can be simple, it's a solution, and it solves the problem of consistency, and that's where technology vendors can come in. So let's talk about user experience. We talked about you need to create compelling user experiences. So we believe that step one, you have to solve consistency, because otherwise anything you design on top of it is flawed. So let's say we solve consistency, which we did. Now let's go on to build compelling user experiences. So compelling user experiences is about creating different experiences on different screen sizes. You have an iPad experience, you can potentially have a 3-inch experience. You can have integrated things, you have related videos, you have playlists that are next to the player, and all these things are, again, solvable. Now, once you have the consistency done, you can just leverage APIs, or within the player itself, it can provide interesting user experiences. This is a sample of one of the players that we actually configured via Brightcove, and you would just embed that one player, it gets you the whole experience on that site. So it's just as simple as that. And then in terms of creating user experiences, it's very easy to actually modify this and make it optimized. So say you have a player that is on a site like this, and this happens to be a Brightcove site. What you can do is you can actually, with Brightcove, go in and configure the different look and feel of the player, and it gets immediately reflected in the player. This all gets easy once you solve, again, the consistency problem, because now any API or any custom work that you build on top of a player is going to reflect on all devices. This can be an iPad, this can be an Android, etc. So the user experience problem becomes easier, and now you can interact with CSS, or with Brightcove we have BEML that we added that you can also, which is the Brightcove Experience Markup Language, that you can customize the player and create compelling experiences. One thing I will mention, we absolutely believe that different devices need different experiences. This is just as a side note. The consumption of media happens differently on each device. If you go research your user base, you'll find that a lot of them use the 3-inch screen to actually watch content on the go. They're probably on the bus or doing something in a downtime. They're waiting between two different things, and they'll watch a video. So this is the type of use case that you see. The other use case with a tablet is when people are actually just sitting at home, probably in an airport or on a plane. This is when they have more time. It's not just a filler, it's actually allocated time that gives them a chance to watch long-form content. So when you think about user experiences across different devices, don't think HTML5 versus Flash, think screen sizes and what that means to the end user. Because it does make a difference. And this is when you can start thinking about, okay, so do I put a button for the user to watch something later if he's on a 3-inch screen because I know he's on the go, versus on an iPad, I know he's watching it, for the whole time. There's some also behavioral differences when you're watching TV. There's research that shows that 80% of people hold a mobile device in their hand when they're watching TV, which is an astounding number. I'm guilty of that myself. I don't know who here does that, but as well. So what can you do? There's a whole lot of concepts in terms of companion apps, like you have a video playing, can you do something else as you're watching? People love multitasking. So is there something you can leverage out of the experience? Now HTML5 allows you to do all these things, and you want to make sure that the player and the platform that you choose allows you to do these things seamlessly, because again, the fragmentation is not easy to deal with if you're building all these custom experiences on a variety of devices. So I'm not gonna, just want to show you a couple of examples that some people prefer to actually copy the experience between a laptop environment from an iPad environment, and that's part of the user experience that they want, which is fine. I mean, it depends on your use case, but that's something that you know, it's going to be up to you to decide. And I have a couple of examples here that I'm not going to spend much time on, but my point is that amazing experiences are needed and can be built, and you have to think of them when you think HTML5, because it does, when you talked about it before, it does mean mobile devices. So what can we do differently on mobile devices that doesn't happen on desktops? So keep that question in mind when you think HTML5. So in terms of advertising, what about advertising? So first question you might ask, aren't there existing solutions today for HTML5 advertising? So yes and no. There are solutions, but they're not non-custom solutions. Solutions today barely leverage fast, not a whole lot leverage fast actually. Brightcove is one of the first platforms that launched fast integration, because we believe in standards, we believe in trying to making things simple to our customers, and every time you go through a standards route, you're encouraging mass adoption, and you're encouraging and you're endorsing the standard itself. So we've worked closely with DoubleClick from Google to actually launch a vast implementation that we're bringing to other ad servers as well. And the reason why I bring this up is because we're the first people who actually try to do this. So I remember back in January of this year, we hosted a private webinar with most of the ad servers that we work with, and there are a large number, like we work with 40 of them. And we started talking about, so what do you think is HTML5 advertising? And we got so many different answers. And it was a space that no one had a standard answer for. So what we've done at Brightcove, we said what we're gonna do is we're gonna move in a direction. So the best bet is to make a move towards a direction that follows standards. So that's why we chose fast, and we believe it's going to be a core thing. So why? Well, let me just give you an example. When new Mac OSs come out, do you worry about whether your Flash is going to work or not, or your video is going to work or not inside of Flash? No. But without a standard implementation that sits on top of something that solves the fragmentation problem, you will. Which means if iOS 6 comes out and you have, say, a free will in it, I'm picking random names, not anything specific, but you have an ad integration that you have for iOS 5 and you've tested it and it works, iOS 6 comes out, remember all these differences and events that we talked about and the things that a plugin would need to actually work? Well, they might be different with iOS 6. What this means is, if it's custom, you have to go back and do maintenance work to actually support this new OS. And every time you think custom, it means maintenance, it means dollars. So this is why you would need a universal solution, more towards standards. And if you're not using standards, maybe you're using a custom implementation, but if it leverages an abstraction layer that I talked about, then the OS differences don't matter. So you either use a vast solution or you use a custom implementation that leverages an abstraction layer. Otherwise, your maintenance cost is going to continue to grow. And that's why we've done both. We've done vast and we've done an abstraction layer to kind of minimize costs for our customers. But the key thing here is that there's still no standards that everyone follows. So that's what needs to happen in HTML5, and we'll try to summarize it moving forward. Just to show you one thing, this is the same video player that I showed you before from BrightGov, and you just click on it and it serves pre-rolls. There's no plugins, there's no work that you need to do. And this is why I believe Fast solves a lot of the problems for many of the people. So, all right. Next is, we talked about analytics. There are no specific standards or things that people have for analytics. So what about analytics? The solution is having, again, an abstraction layer that tells you the same exact things. If the video started, then stopped, the player always tells you that in a consistent fashion. If you get that, then your analytics plugin will work and it will get you accurate data. Otherwise, you're not going to get the accurate data, and you might not get data at all. So that's one thing you need to remember. So we've launched on top of our abstraction layer universal APIs that do that. So this is one area, again, like if I want to go back and highlight the areas that technology vendors can solve versus partners versus standards, I would say that the experiences, consistency, and analytics can be solved by technology vendors. Advertising needs to be solved by both technology vendors and standard boards that actually drive this to move forward. So the last area that I wanted to highlight is content protection. So content protection means a lot of different things. People think of it as encryption, and then people think of it as DRM. Well, in both cases, there's still not a whole lot of standards. So what needs to happen is we need standards, and we need people to push these standards. And once they're pushed, we need them to be adopted by the devices and the browsers. So because there's a lot of dependencies specifically in this area, we believe that this is possibly the area that's going to take the longest while to actually evolve and be solid. Well, the good news is it's not, if we go back to my original slide, this is the area that's not applicable to all, it's applicable to the few. So that's why my answer was, is HTML5 ready? And what are the next steps? Well, it depends. If you're someone that's trying to just push video to different tablets and iPhones and Android devices and maybe other OSs that are in mobile devices like Windows phones, etc., then the solution is out there because technology vendors have solved it, BrightGov has solved it. If you're trying to build user experiences around it, then HTML5 is ready as well. Now the question is, if you want to do advertising and analytics, technology vendors and standards are in the process of solving it. Some aspects of it are solved, some aspects are not. If you want to reach all devices, put advertising and analytics and put DRM on top of it, it's not ready for you. So, and this is when you might need to wait a little bit just because there's a lot of dependencies for this to happen. To try and summarize this, HTML5 is ready for some. Some things can be solved by technology vendors, like consistency and user experience. Some things can be solved by technology vendors driving standards like advertising. Like in our case, we tried with DoubleClick. We're trying to push our work to IAB to be a standard. So that's one thing that we're trying to do. And some things need device and browser adoption. And this is when we talk about content protection and DRM. There are some solutions for encryption for mobile web. I mean, don't get me wrong, but they're not the level of DRM that is required by a lot of licensed content. And again, that's why it's applicable to the few. So there's some solutions out there, but we can do a lot more. I actually encourage you to go to the Brightcove site. You can actually copy this. I try to shorten it. And you'll get more information. We have published a white paper about all these differences that I talked about between different devices, what we've done, what we've seen, why should you care, and all these things. They're all in these white papers. I encourage you to go and download them. They're a good, easy read, so and should be helpful to cover some of these topics that we talked about today. I'm about 6 minutes ahead of time, but I try to leave room for questions. I know it's late in the day, but I definitely encourage you to ask me questions. So, any questions? And I know a lot of these things were repeated over the past 2 days. Like I know I've attended a few sessions and a lot of DRM conversations on HTML5, a lot of advertising conversations. So I try to summarize it in a way that's helpful, in a way that it's the last session. It's everything you need to do. So, questions?
Hopefully not a silly question. I guess what you just said there at the end, I've been thinking about everything you said. I've heard multiple times over the last couple of days. Was there really enough to justify actually doing a whole separate summit on this topic yet? Or was it just that big a topic that it just sort of demanded that somebody just clarify things for you?
So I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer this question, but my answer to that is it's always good for everyone to know what's out there and what's left to do. So hopefully at least the takeaway that you get is what is available to me today, what can I do, what can't I do, and why, and if I can't do it today, what should I expect and what are the dependencies? For what I can do today, what are the partners and people that I need to work with, what are the things that I can worry about, and what are the people I can work with, what are the resources. If you get some of these questions that are critical to launching an HTML5 experience answered, then the summit accomplished its goals. Does that make sense? Other questions?
Do you see any convergence on solving these issues in W3C and HTML5? The work is not closed. HTML work is not closed. HTML5 maybe.
Yeah, so the question was, do you see any way a lot of these issues will converge in W3C? So I will answer you by saying, if you look at CSS, which has been available for a long time, it's in W3C, it's a spec. If you've been a web developer in a previous life, or maybe today, you'll know that there's still differences between browsers. And if you go and view the source of every website, you'll see if it's Chrome, do this, if it's Safari, do that. That's something that's been in the spec for the longest time. So it can be in a spec, it can be, I don't know how, something that's been done for a long time, but still differences occur. I mean, from my current and previous experiences, I know that if you give the spec to 2 different people, they'll interpret it differently. And unless you put them in one room, which will never happen between different companies, that will never be interpreted the same. So my answer to that is W3C will try, but it has never solved it before, and I don't think it's going to be solved this time. Just based on previous experiences. Other questions?
so far, what's some of the better analytics, or what's the broadest analytics tags that are working with HTML5? Is Google Analytics pretty broad? I mean, what's kind of the best? I know there's not perfect.
Yes.
So in terms of analytics, all the plugins rely on what's happening in the player and the playback. If we're talking about video analytics versus page analytics, there's two different things. But if we talk about player analytics and playback analytics, what you're mostly looking for is events that the player tells you that are happening. So for example, I started playback, an ad started, an ad stopped, the user clicked pause, he went full screen, he exited full screen, now he's back, he shut down the player. And your plugin can actually get all this information and get it, and you can generate a lot of interesting data like an engagement report. He watched an ad, and right after it, he dropped off. So you can do a lot of interesting things. So there's a lot of plugins that do analytics. It's still an evolving world. You got the regular analytics plugins like Nielsen and Comscore and others that are still in the process of launching JavaScript. I believe they just launched a few, just I think today or yesterday or this week. There are some plugins that are launching in JavaScript. All of them previously were Swift-based for Flash, so they had to go and redo a JavaScript plugin instead. There's Adobe Omniture that's been used, and Google Analytics, and these are the ones that we see mostly used with HTML5 players, and there's more companies like Inviva trying to solve things like that. There's a wide range of solutions out there, and each one brings you different value, and it's, from a customer perspective, it's up to you to decide what kind of analytics you're looking for, and thus you decide which one is best. Any other questions? All right, so appreciate your time, everyone. Thank you. We're actually 15 minutes ahead of time, which is not a bad thing on the last day, so appreciate your time.